Everyone, and welcome to the April 2nd, 2012 meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee. We will be taking general public comment. I think what we'll do is we'll take general public comment today before the discussion of our agenda items. We will move our closed session to the end because that discussion is likely to be a little lengthier than the open session items, so that we can get everybody who's here who wants to be heard and go back to work to have that opportunity. So I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and begin our agenda with general public comment, and then we'll move to item 5. So for general public comment, I have one card, and that is Dr. Weissman. But I don't see him.
He's here.
He's here. Oh, there he is. Okay. Dr. Weissman, welcome.
Good afternoon, sir. Thank you so much. Again, this time I'm here representing the budget advocates. The white paper, as you all know, has just recently been released. I just handed you what is really the hub of the white paper. That is the 21 recommendations. These recommendations were agonized over, essentially, and the process, which I know you're familiar with because you go through it all the time, trying to bring out the salient points of any given issue. We can stop and talk about any of them you wish. I think over the next few weeks we'll be talking about essentially all of them. The item number 1 is probably worth mentioning. As we did last year, we are again recommending that the mayor declare a state of emergency, a fiscal emergency, so that certain activities can be done to take immediate action. We believe, and I believe you are of the same mind, that the CAO's recent report, the recent FSR, and the recent reports that he's made at Budget and Finance Committee just last week was very clear to indicate that we may be able to get through this coming year by tightening our belts and improving our efficiencies, but it really was very difficult to find a way to sustain our city after that. At least that was the interpretation that I would give you, and I think you're, of course, going to make your own interpretation. That being the case, a whole new process needs to be done if we're to survive. And I think the process that is most likely to help us the most is the performance-based budgeting concept that is now coming down the road. You're going to hear from the controller later. It was a document of hers that gave great stimulus to it, a document and some discussion by Mr. Englander at one of the recent meetings of this group that gave additional acceleration to it, and I hope to be discussing that with you in future weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Weissman. And I have no more general public comment cards. Is there anyone else who wanted to be heard on general public comment? If not, that will close general public comment for this hearing. Anybody who would like to be heard on a particular agenda item, please fill out a card and bring it forward. All right, so before we go to the other regular items, I would like to suggest, if my colleagues have no objection, that we move items 11 and 12 forward on consent, and that we note and file items 10 and 13. 11 and 12 as consent, and items 10 and 13 note and file as they've been resolved.
Fine with me.
Yep. All right, without objection, that will be the action of this committee. That brings us then to our regular agenda. By the way, I'm sorry, I should have stated at the outset, I apologize, colleagues. I'm Paul Krikorian, chair of the committee. I'm joined by my colleagues Mitchell Englander and Bill Rosendahl, and we will now proceed to item number 5. Okay. Okay.
If I may, just yet, on 10 and 13, that can be received and filed instead of note and filed.
All right. Colleagues,
Yes, sure.
I misspoke, should be received and filed rather than noted and filed. Thank you for that correction. Without objection, that'll be the action.
Okay.
All right, that brings us to item 5.
Item 5 is a controller report relative to the revenue estimate for the upcoming fiscal year, as well as an estimate the amount of revenue required to meet the annual debt service requirements for principal and interest for the city's general obligation bonds pursuant to Charter Section 311. This is also referred to as the controller's March 1 report.
Good afternoon, committee members.
Good afternoon.
Matthias Farfan for the Office of the Controller. As Ray mentioned, Charter Section 311 requires the controller to annually submit to the mayor with a copy to the city council an estimate of city revenues, along with an estimate of money required for all bonded indebtedness of the city. Before you is said report. Exhibits 1 and 2 of the report, which are towards the back of the report, provide the list of estimated receipts for the current fiscal year as well as for next fiscal year. Table 9 of the report provides an estimate of money required for all bonded indebtedness. It has a history there and also our estimate for next year. In preparing the report, the controller met with leading local economists and reviewed various economic forecasts. In summary, there's general agreement that the local economy is expected to grow this year and the next year as well. The controller anticipates that this growth will be approximately 1% the current year and 1% next year. Unfortunately, this growth is below trend. And page 2 of the cover letter of your report includes a chart which pretty much illustrates this point. Which it'll show if revenues had continued on their regular trend versus what actually occurred and what the go-forward trend will be. And you can see there's quite a large gap between the two. Regarding the revenue estimates, the controller estimates that the current year general fund revenues will be $31.5 million less than what was in the adopted budget. The primary reason for this reduction is the revenues reported by departments to the controller's office. We send out a letter telling them to report to us by, up to January 31st, based on the receipts to date, what they anticipate the rest of their departmental receipts will be till year end. And once that all was added up, that came out to around $25 million below budget. We have discussed it with the CAO. They're following up with them to sort out, if there's what's going on, if that can be made up. But that'll be part of, future FSRs, and also when the mayor's proposed budget comes out in a couple of weeks, you should see what the actual revised estimates are for those departmental receipts. I just want to put that out there. Regarding the revenue estimates for next year, the controller estimates that there'll be 46.7 million more in 12-13 than they are from the 11-12 estimates. Again, that amount includes those departmental receipts in there, which are also fluid. Those are policy items that, if new fees are approved or increases, that can all factor in what those departmental receipts will be. That said, if you have any questions regarding what's in the report, I'd be more than happy to answer those questions at this
But
time.
on that point, you don't assume any policy changes, do you?
I don't. We don't assume any policy changes.
Colleagues? Mr. Englander.
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick question on the bank overtime. I didn't see a chart with a breakdown of where the $83 million for 2010-11 is. I'm sure it's in the report somewhere. I'm missing it.
We just refer to it in the actual cover letter, but we don't provide an actual chart in the report.
Do you have a breakdown of where those are?
It's mainly sworn police.
Mainly, but I was trying to figure out if there were others.
It's about 75 million out of the 83. It's a large portion. It's almost all of it. It is in sworn police overtime.
Okay.
Yes, and that's a concern raised by the controller in the report, is just as we move forward, that sometimes these one-time solutions can add up as we go out. Currently, it's just we've just begun to increase the banks in unused overtime. So instead of paying out cash, we've chosen to bank it. So long as it's kept in check, there shouldn't be a problem.
But then when we end up paying it out, we pay it out at their higher rate. Is that
We
correct?
pay at the higher rate, so whatever the employee's hourly rate it is at the time of departure, that's the rate it's paid out at. So that would be a future liability as those employees retire or depart from city service, it would be paid out at their current rate.
And is that pension-based as well? So in other words, if they took it all in 1 year, does that count towards their highest 12 months?
That one would not be, because it's just overtime.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, you do raise issues about the LAPD, obviously, in this, which we'll save for another discussion, not here. But am I right that the emergency reserve for next year is $120.3 million, and the contingency reserve is $98.5? Is that what you're projecting? Or you see as the basis for the general fund?
That would be part of the proposed budget, would actually mention those amounts. It all depends on where actual revenues will be at year end, what they're finally projected to be at in the adopted budget, and what the expenditures will be.
Yeah.
And based on those two amounts, we'll determine how much will revert to the reserve fund, or how much additional funds will be needed from the reserve fund to make up any shortfalls.
Right.
But right now, yes, it's around $200 million.
Now, when you hear the mayor talk about we might have to lay off more people, does that fit in at all in your understanding? Not the layoffs, but the amount of money that we see a challenge here that needs to be focused on differently than before?
Well, in this report, we report on revenues exclusively, but it does tie in that on that chart on page 2 of the cover letter, where it shows that revenue trend line, that line on the top there, where it's like a broken line. That one shows where the revenues would be anticipated to be if they followed the prior year trends, which is usually around, well, it's been around 3.6 to 4% per year growth. And pretty much all of our contracts, have assumed that growth in revenue. So the expenditures also have, cost of living adjustments that grow at that same pace. But if revenues actually come in below that anticipated trend, then that's where you end up with that structural deficit. And that's when some cuts need to be made in order to bring us back in line with the revenue.
Hey, remember a few months ago we thought we had a larger deficit than this?
Mm-hmm.
What changed the dynamic on that?
That I'm aware of, we didn't, I think it's been reported at 150 to 200 million was the last estimate that the controller had put out in their FSR, and then they currently have been reporting a $220 million deficit. So it's actually gone up a little bit from their previous estimate.
I see. Okay. I'm done. Thank you.
Yes.
Actually, can we ask the CAO's office to come
Yes.
up as well? Can you address the issue that Mr. Rosendahl raised first just now? Because I think the change has been trending upward as we've been
It has.
forward even over March, recent estimates of within a month or so ago. So what's the current outlook?
So right now, we're looking at probably a little over $220 million shortfall for the out year. That may change depending on circumstances, somewhat with the revenue and so forth. But right now, that's sort of preliminary number. As we move forward in the next couple of weeks, we'll hone that number a little bit better. But we're looking at certainly a sizable gap for 12-13.
And are the CAO's revenue estimates in concert with what's been presented by the controller, or are there significant differences?
Right now, given that at the time that the numbers were released by the controller, certainly we're in general in sync with the numbers. We have the benefit of an additional few weeks of data, so we can get, for example, the results from the winter quarter, the December quarter. So that actually we have the benefit a little bit more information. And so as we assist the mayor in his budget process, you will see differences in some of the numbers. And then that's really because of the additional time that we have to actually refine and get some more data and so forth.
Okay. There's a fair amount of discussion in here about revenues and their impact on debt obligations and the ratio, and whether it's in compliance with the city's debt policy. And I'm frankly unclear about why there's the two different limits on debt, according to our policy, one on voter-approved and total. What is the history of that? What's the reason for that differentiation?
The original debt policy actually goes all the way back to 1998, I believe, is when those policies were put in place. The one being the 6% on non-voter approved debt, and then you have the 15% on both non-voter approved and voter approved. The 6% on a non-voter is fairly in line with recommendations from GFOA and other agencies. The thought is you don't want to accumulate a whole bunch, quite a bit of debt out there that has not really been approved by the general public. So it's really a fairly prudent policy in looking at our debt. But we can go back and provide some more history on how those actually came about back then.
Okay, thank you. In Table 9 on the report that deals with debt service requirements, the total debt service requirements for fiscal year 12-13 is $625 million. And then in Table 10, which deals with city debt policy compliance, the debt service requirement for 12-13 is listed at $394 million, which I assume is only general fund.
No, it includes other items in there, but on table...
What's the discrepancy between those two?
The discrepancy, if you go back to Table 9, all the items that indicate revenue bonds are not part of the debt limit calculation. So if it's a revenue bond, like the parking system revenue bonds or the solid resources revenue bonds and the wastewater system revenue bonds, if you deduct those debt service amounts, that's where you arrive at what's on the subsequent chart. So it excludes revenue bonds.
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We also have one card on this, if there's no other questions, colleagues. We have one card, that's Dr. Weissman.
I mentioned earlier that the possibility of balancing our books in the coming fiscal year looks like the last year that the CAO thinks we can do this. I certainly hope I'm wrong, but that's the way it looks right now. I just handed you, if you'll flip the page over to the written material, the front page of the tax revenue anticipatory notes. This year, instead of paying tax revenue anticipatory notes off within the fiscal year, we have saved half of the repayment into the next year. So this year's tax revenue anticipatory notes, or TRAN, will have half of its principal and, of course, the balance of its interest paid in fiscal 2013. I've asked the CAO, I've asked several other people who I thought would know, are we amassing that information? The graph that's on the back side of that shows a blue line, which is the result of all the activity of the TRAN to keep our cash position above zero. Without the TRAN, we'd go below zero. In other words, we wouldn't have enough money to spend to pay for our debts for the first 6 months of the year. Then with property taxes and business taxes, we begin to make positive balances. But in this case, we're going to have to amass a $600 million surplus in addition to everything else we do by the end of the year, so that we can say the tax revenue anticipatory notes were paid off or paid off with 2012 income, rather than paying a tax on a tax and paying a debt with a no debt. I would certainly suggest that is not what we want to do, and you'll find that these concepts are items number 11 and 13 of the 21 in the Budget Advocate's recommendations. a matter of great concern to us, and I'd certainly like to see how that will be resolved.
Okay, thank you. Colleagues, recommendation is just to note and file the report on item 5 without objection.
If I may I just respond and make a clarification? So in the current year, yes, we did borrow $1.2 billion for a TRAN. That is for cash flow and also to prepay our pension payments. As part of the maturity schedule, it was broken down, as you can see actually on the one page, into 4 different repayments. While these are the actual maturity dates of February 29th, March 30th, April, and August 12th, the city actually sets aside funds for those maturity dates. So we'll actually set aside the first payment in February. We'll do so again in March, and we'll do also in May. And in May is actually when we'll set aside the $600 million to make that payment in August. So the city has basically set aside all of this fund and has appropriated the funding to pay off the trans within the current year.
All right, thank you. That brings us then to items 6 and 7, which I think we can hear together.
Yes, so item 6 is a CEO report relative to the execution of a 3-year contract with 2 one-year extension options with municipal revenue advisors to reinstitute the use tax or revenue enhancement program. And then 7 is another CEO report relative to the extension of a 3-year contract with 2 one-year extension options with Muni Services, LLC, to reinstitute the sales and use tax allocation review services program.
Maria Gutierrez with the CAO's office. As Mr. Serrano has indicated, you have 2 contracts before you for very critical services that result in revenue generation for the city. The CAO is recommending approval. Regarding item number 6, the purpose of the Use Tax Revenue Enhancement Program is to increase the cooperation of eligible businesses in the city in reporting their use tax transactions to maximize the city's recovery of use tax. This pretty much entails persuading qualified businesses to voluntarily register and participate in the Use Tax Revenue Enhancement Program. The use tax is imposed on consumers as opposed to sellers of tangible personal property that is used, consumed, or stored in the state. The use tax applies to purchases from out-of-state vendors that are not required to collect tax on their sales. The UTREP contract, the prior contract was also held by MRA, Municipal Revenue Advisors. That contract expired in May 2009. The Office of Finance released an RFP around that time in June 22nd, 2009. 2 firms submitted proposals. However, MRA submitted for the UTREP portion of the program, and Muni Services, which is also before you today, submitted a proposal for the sales and use tax allocation review portion. The delay in the execution of this contract is tied to complex contract negotiations and legal issues that have been ongoing since 2009. MRA will be compensated on a contingency fee basis. They will receive 17.5% of net additional use tax revenue each quarter by the city as a result of the UTREP. The rate is higher than the 15% rate under the former contract due to the nature of the work. Under the previous contract, which was for a 5-year term, the contractor recovered $495,000 in additional revenue for the city and received compensation of $74,000, which was deducted from the $495,000. Would you like to go over the second one? Do you have questions
I'm
on
just
this?
curious why from 2009 to 2000, whatever we are, we were in conflict, that they continued to operate. Would you give us a little more appreciation of that issue?
I'll defer to the Office of Finance on this one.
Ed Cabrera, Assistant Director, Office of Finance. The 2 contracts before this committee today involve both sales and use tax misallocation review, as well as a use tax rebate incentive program. These programs had two issues that finance worked both with the vendors as well as with the city attorney to address, number one, issues of conflict of interest or potential interest of conflict of interest, as well as the overlap of services between the two vendors. In 2009, there was a misallocation decision made by the Board of Equalization that would have reallocated revenue from the county pool to the city of Pomona. The vendor that worked for the city of Pomona also was a vendor that worked for the city of Los Angeles. So there were issues that concerned the Office of Finance as well as the city attorney's office concerning conflict of interest. Those concerns were addressed through legal analysis as well as negotiations with the vendor to ensure that there was protective language within the contract that would address future issues of that regard. With regards to the overlap of services between the two vendors, the prior contract resulted in disputes involving both vendors. Office of Finance again worked with the two vendors that were selected as well as with the city attorney to ensure that there was a clear delineation of services to address any potential overlap of services. Again, both of these contracts are complementary and supplement existing services provided by the Office of Finance, and we do recommend your approval.
Is there any relationship between these two vendors?
No, there's not.
There's no interlocking officers or directors or anything. It strikes me as, it continues to strike me as odd that there's so few people who are willing to respond to these RFPs to do this work.
No, there's no relationship between Muni Services and MRA. Office of Finance did go out to competitive bid on these contracts. Again, they're contingency fee contracts, which do limit the potential use of CPA firms. There are issues regarding independence, and there are distinct regulations by the California Board of Public Accountancy that address whether CPA firms can bid on these types of contracts. We did have various participants in our proposers conferences. Some vendors choose not to go any further once they receive full information, but there is no relationship between these two vendors.
And speaking of the contingency, so the Muni Services contract is the contingency fee is being reduced from the incumbent contract, as I understand it.
That's correct.
Existing contract.
Office of Finance negotiated that reduction, so we were successful in maintaining the same level of service with a lower compensation rate for the vendor.
But the other one on item 6 is going in the opposite direction by a like amount. So
it's going in the opposite direction. The reason for that is that the UTREP program requires much more extensive work by the vendor as well as the participants. The participants in the program, meaning the businesses, essentially have to implement modifications in their purchasing procedures within their companies. So it does require extensive discussions with the vendors, identification of those vendors. Also, our MRA, the selected respondent, does have to work with these businesses individually to ensure that they fully understand the scope of the changes that need to be implemented within their purchasing programs.
Yeah, just a quick question. On the MRA contract, it appears here that part of their function is to review the city departments, supply equipment purchases, records, submit recommendations on to the city in ways they can maximize use tax recovery. I'm reading that as to mean that they do an inventory of what the city's liability is as well on that? And because there's a portion of this that would then go to the state, is that correct?
Correct. What the second part of the services with MRA is correct, as you point out. What we've tasked MRA to do is review the other city departments' purchases to ensure that use tax is properly being reflected and remitted to the city of Los Angeles. So once again, there may be some types of procedural changes that individual departments may need to implement to track these purchases, as well as to ensure that the full amount of use tax that the city is able to attain is received.
So my question is, if they're able to identify a portion that the city is liable for, do they get compensated for that, for our failure to report it ourselves?
Well, it could be, well, yes, any additional well, let me explain. Any additional revenue that the city receives from the work of the vendors is subject to compensation. So the contingency fee is put in place to ensure that the city does receive additional revenue prior to the vendor being paid. So any work that the vendor implements to ensure that procedural changes are made, and it could be, again, looking at what these purchases entail to ensure that the proper reporting procedures to the Board of Equalization are implemented.
Right. And so if there's a gap somewhere or something missing in the city's own failure to report by one of the departments, and they're able to identify that, then they get compensation off the city's own error. It's not, it's yes, it's true, it's new revenue perhaps to the city, but it's paid for by the city. It's a transfer of funds. So the question is, are there any departments in last year's report or the prior year that show they were able to identify what I'll call new revenue, but it was only on the city side?
This is the first step that MRA will be taking. They did not review this in their prior contract.
And I'm wondering why then the controller's office wouldn't be doing at least that part of it, why we would hire an outside consultant who gets compensation for something the city had failed to do in one of the departments, if there's anything. And I guess we don't know yet if we've never done this before.
Correct.
But I don't know why we'd be paying a commission. I have a problem with that, to an outside agency for our own failure to report one of the departments to identify machinery or whatever it is that we bought on the use tax portion that was missed. They catch it. We're almost penalizing ourselves.
Well, again, the use tax regulations are very complex. It could be simply how these purchases are recorded and tracked, also the manner in which the purchases are made, depending on where the situs is and the location of the use of the purchases, the equipment, and so forth. So there are some complex regulations that the vendor is able to interpret and provide recommendations to the city, and on a go-forward basis, these are changes that the departments would be able to implement on their own as well.
Is this a one-year contract?
It's a 3-year contract with a option for 2 one-year renewals.
Can I make a recommendation that, assuming we approve this, that in at least in the first report or at least 1 year's time, they come back to this committee with a report on what they found on the city side of perhaps either failure to report ourselves or anything we need to change with the department, so we don't have to wait 3 years and then get a report back to say that we found these errors and then act on it then, if we could approve it with that contingency?
Certainly, we can report back, and actually the Office of Finance may also be in a position where we would seek the assistance of the City Council to ensure that other departments are following recommendations that the vendor does submit.
Right, okay, thank you.
Is there any potential for a conflict of interest if either of these vendors were to represent a different governmental entity, the state or another subdivision of the state, for example, and also be seeking a contingency fee from them?
Actually, that was the issue that I referenced, and that primarily was an issue that hit home with the sales and use tax contract with Muni Services. We did address that through our consultation with the city attorney's office. We do have language within the sales and use tax contract that does address the potential for conflict of interest. But this was the issue that I referenced regarding the city of Pomona. So we have dealt with that within the body of the contract.
Okay, great. We're also joined by Mr. Kretz. Mr. Kretz, do you have any questions on this?
No, I don't have any additional questions.
The last time we were here discussing one of these contracts, I asked that we prepare a summary chart of all of these sorts of arrangements that we may have. Is that in the works?
That's in the works. That will be coming forward, yes.
Okay, when do you think that we might?
I would anticipate within 2 to 3 weeks we should have that completed.
Very good. Okay, very good. Thank you. So, colleagues, I would suggest that we approve the recommendations with Mr. Englander's addition that there be a report back within the first year of the contract on the issues that he discussed.
So moved.
All right, without objection, that will be the action of the committee.
There'll be approval for both 6 and 7. Okay.
All right, that brings us to number 8.
8, yes. Item 8 is a city attorney report relative to the retention of Hawkins, Delafield, and Wood under a 3-year contract to assist the city attorney's office in negotiating contract on behalf of the Department of Public Works, Bureau of Sanitation for municipal solid waste alternative treatment facility.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, committee members, Deputy City Attorney John Carvalho. And with me is the Bureau representative.
I can't hear a word you're saying, I'm sorry. Hey, can we get everybody in the room to just quiet down a little? I can't hear a word.
Good afternoon, Deputy City Attorney John Carvalho. And with me is the Bureau of Sanitation representative.
Javier Polanco, Bureau of Sanitation.
This is to recommend approval of outside counsel to assist the city attorney's office in negotiating a contract with an outside vendor for an alternative technology waste-to-energy facility called the ALTEC project. The ALTEC project was born out of the Renew LA plan to reduce the city's and eventually eliminate the city's reliance on landfilling of municipal solid waste. The ALTEC facility is going to convert the solid waste to energy. The firm that was selected through an RFP process, Green Conversion Systems, was selected through the RFP process. It was approved by the Board of Public Works and the City Council. The City Attorney's Office issued an RFP to request expertise, outside counsel expertise in negotiating that contract. The City Attorney's Office received about 16 proposals from various firms. The City Attorney's Office then narrowed it down to 6 firms that were interviewed. Hawkins, Delafield, and Wood is a firm that has extensive experience in this area. They were selected, and we're before you today to ask for approval for that outside counsel.
Just to ask it directly, why do we need outside counsel to negotiate this contract? We have subject matter expertise on the client end, I would assume. So why do we need a specialized law firm to negotiate the agreement?
There are a lot of moving parts on this contract. It's a finance, design, build, operate, maintain, and then eventually transfer to the city. They're both federal environmental rules and regulations that have to be complied with. There are state environmental rules and regulations to be complied with. There are siting issues. There are just so many different moving parts. It would, it'd be advisable to have outside counsel to assist, especially outside counsel that has done this in other jurisdictions, which Hawkins, Delafield, and Wood has done. This is not the first time they've negotiated a contract for this type of facility. In fact, it was Hawkins, Delafield, and Wood that the city contracted with to assist in the first such facility, alternative technology facility, 20 years ago.
Lancer
project. This was the same firm, Hawkins, Delafield, and Wood. That Lancer project obviously had never bore fruit, but they did assist on that project.
So the scope of work is not simply negotiating. It's also, it sounds like, developing a regulatory compliance plan and sort of anticipating some of those issues that would likely come up over the lifetime of the project?
Those are issues that would be involved, yes.
Mr. Rosenthal.
A couple questions. It says fiscal impact. Approval of the city attorney's recommendation will authorize an initial appropriations of $500,000. By initial, do you think it's going to be a lot more or what?
It's hard to say at this point, depending on how the negotiations go. It's a 3-year contract term is what's being requested for approval. The $500,000, it's hard to put a firm number on that, but that was the estimate based on past experience.
If it's more, will you get back to us on that?
Absolutely.
Can you speak?
Has the site been selected for the Alleytac project?
No, the site's being selected by the vendor, GCS, and that site has not been disclosed. The GCS says they have a site, but it has not been disclosed yet to the city through that RFP process. So.
When they disclose it, there'll be a normal process of accepting it or not, right?
Correct.
Okay. This is a request, but we just don't know. You don't know if 500 will go 500 more. I mean, can we put a cap on it, or you'll come back to us with that?
Well, the cap on this approval would be $500,000. We'd have to come back to you for additional funding.
What's your time frame of getting this done?
Well, the contract term that's being requested is a 3-year contract term. Hopefully, the negotiation's certainly not going to take that long. If GCS, the contract negotiations fail with GCS, then the next highest ranked proposer would be in line for contract negotiations.
Okay, that's it.
Yeah, having been one of the authors on Renew LA, the co-authors of this, and having seen a lot of these facilities in operation, I know how complex they can be. I know these funds are not coming out of the general fund as well. Who does the attorney report to directly? Who are they? It's outside counsel, but are they reporting on the negotiations through the department or through the city attorney's office?
It'll be the city attorney's office, and I would be the point person from the city attorney's office working with outside counsel on the negotiations. I'll be involved in all the
Will
negotiations.
CLA be involved in this as well?
No. Not on the negotiations of the contract.
Okay. And according to this on the council, and looking at this, we're looking at entering into a contract with the outside counsel for negotiation with one facility, but the council actually authorized the hiring of outside counsel for the development of 2 facilities, and we're currently speaking to different companies. Why are we only forwarding this on as a negotiation with one when we have 2 going pending right now?
Well, GCS is the highest ranked proposer for the commercial facility.
Right, but
the recommendation from council was to award a contract for the emerging technology facility to Urbazer. That was for a much smaller facility, a 200-ton per day facility. We're talking about the commercial on this.
But why aren't we doing it together at the same time? If they're going to be actually negotiating the contract for one when we've got the department negotiating the other one, that makes no sense to me, when it should be done together, which was the plan.
Well,
Can we have somebody from the department speak on that?
Well, sure, but if I can just address the negotiations aspect, there wouldn't be negotiations with both Urbazer, GCS in the room, and the Hawkins, Delafield, and Wood in the city attorney's office negotiating those 2 contracts simultaneously. They would be separate negotiations regardless.
Yeah, well, they're separate, but they're married in goals and objectives and citing, and there are other commonalities. While they're negotiated separately, there's a lot of overlap in terms of working with the departments, and and I believe that's why the city council authorized entering into outside counsel on both. And so this is only coming back with one.
Correct. The city attorney's office is going to go back to council with the recommendation as to whether and to how there can be another facility awarded to Urbazer, despite the fact that Urbazer didn't submit a proposal on the alternative technology facility, the emerging technology facility. Rather, they submitted on the commercial. City Council asked that Urbazer be awarded the emerging technology facility. Urbazer didn't propose for the...
But I believe some of those discussions are still occurring, is that correct?
They are, and
So if they're still occurring, this sounds like it may be either too premature, or it's missing the other side of the equation, which is negotiating with the other vendor on the other side of it. I'm not sure why we're not moving forward with that. If that's still being ironed out, shouldn't this come back when that's done?
GCS was the highest ranked proposer. GCS was approved by the board.
On the
and it was
commercial
approved
side.
on the commercial side. So there's no reason to stop now going forward with negotiating with GCS for the commercial, because no matter how it turns out with Urbazer, whether they get a facility, whether they get, a commercial or alternative or none, GCS is still the successful proposer on the commercial side. So
It sounds like, and this was not agendized as a closed session item today, correct?
that is correct.
I'd recommend that it come back at a future date as a closed session item. I've got legal questions on this that we can't discuss in open session. And it doesn't make any sense to me that we're moving forward on this level. I'll go along with whatever the committee suggests, but this is going to be well over probably the amount that's being asked for. This has been many years in the making. Negotiations are critical, and we're not getting the answers we need. Council authorized moving forward on 2. We're only coming back with 1, and it doesn't make any sense to me, but these are legal issues. But that's up to you. I'll go with whatever you guys want to do. That's my recommendation.
I don't hear a legal issue there, but it seems to me that there are some fiscal issues. For example, there could be a significant cost efficiency if you have a single law firm who's dealing with the client on, both projects, that there would be some savings there rather than having it contracted twice. Mr. Shawna, did you want to comment on that? You looked like you were trying to catch my eye.
I was going to say, if there are some questions, we can move it forward to council and be prepared to answer any question, get it agendized, at council as possible, closed session.
Okay. Colleagues, Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, just to follow up to a question that Mr. Krikorian asked, is there not a way that we could expend a lower amount of funds and rely more on the expertise of the vendor?
The expertise of the vendor in negotiating the contract?
I was thinking more the expertise of the department as our client, but yeah.
Well, it's legal issues that are going to be addressed by the outside counsel. Certainly the client has expertise on the technical side, on how the project is going to be designed, how it's going to work, what the input is, what the output's going to be. But the legal issues that are going to be involved in enforcing or ensuring that all the environmental rules are being followed by the facility, that all of the claims of the process, the amount of emissions, for example, that were identified in the RFP by GCS, to hold them to that level of emissions, and to the extent that they exceed those level of emissions, to have the proper mechanisms in the contract to enforce those level of emissions or to create penalties if they exceed those level of emissions. Those sorts of issues, the client really doesn't have the expertise for. That would be, for outside counsel expertise to help on those negotiations.
There were certain power purchase conditions also that would have to be negotiated as well, that the department doesn't have full experience with in power purchase agreements, and we would need an outside expert to help us with negotiating those power purchase agreements as well.
And on the other end, in terms of in-house counsel, I recognize there obviously be some areas that are beyond our in-house expertise. Is there a way to combine the two to reduce the cost? Is everything that we're going to be paying for something that our in-house city attorney office couldn't handle? Or are there some things that we could pick up in some way we could parcel that out to the outside counsel?
Well, through the process, again, I'm going to be involved in the negotiations with the firm Hawkins, Delafield, and Wood. Anything that I can take on that I don't need outside counsel's assistance on, I certainly will do that in order to reduce the cost of the outside counsel. I can't be more specific than that because we haven't, begun the negotiation process, so I'm not exactly, we're not at that stage to start parsing out work, but any work that I can do or our office can do, we will certainly do and not rely on outside counsel.
So we're not just going to automatically farm out the whole thing to them other than a minimal amount of oversight. We'll look at each element carefully and see if we can handle it in-house.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
If I could, I'd like to respond to Mr. Englander and ask him a question. Your instincts could be far beyond mine since Greg Smith, and you historically have been involved in this. I had questions going back. What are you proposing, council member, we should do?
For one, I'd like to, I don't see anything that has a scope of work, or the only thing we got back was a 2-page letter from the city attorney's office talking about, actually it's about a 1-page letter, or 2.5.
Yeah.
Well, if you cut off half the page of letterhead, then it's about a 2-page letter, talking about outside counsel evaluation, that you went through an extensive process and recommending the firm. That's really it. There's not much of a scope of work or discussing exactly what it is they're going to be negotiating. I'd like to see that come back.
I'll support you on that.
So just so that I'm clear, what's before us today is a request for the appropriation of funding. There is no proposed contract yet with the law firm. That's still to be negotiated with the selected law firm?
Correct.
Okay. So would that contract then need to also come back to this committee for approval, or not? Once the appropriation is made, it would go someplace else, I assume. Is that right?
I think at this point, the contract probably should come back. If it's 3 years and over the limit, then it would come back.
Would come back here. Okay. So at the time that a contract comes back, we could have a closed session item to review the contract. We could give additional negotiating instructions to the city attorney's office at that point.
You could, but I would certainly
Request.
want to have yes.
The contract term would be 3 years, so it wouldn't need council approval for the contract. You need council approval for the outside counsel. Council needs to approve the expenditure for outside counsel. It doesn't have to approve this contract per se because it's going to be a 3-year contract.
Yeah,
Under the charter, it
whether
doesn't
or not we approve the appropriation may very well, be directly related to whether or not we approve of the scope of work and the terms of the contract and who the selection is and so forth. So they are sort of linked. Well, Mr. England, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead.
If you had anything further.
No, I didn't.
So in the evaluation process, since this particular firm has several dozen waste energy projects under its belt, did the city attorney's office undertake to verify with other cities or other clients that this law firm has had in connection with those projects, the level of satisfaction, whether they stayed within budget, whether additional appropriations were required after the initial contract, any of those sorts of things?
Yes, and the firm, it's a well-respected firm. It has done several projects, both in California and outside of California. They have a project going on in San Diego. The city attorney's office in San Diego has been very happy with their work product.
And was the cost of those negotiations in line with this, or are you able to get that consistent with attorney-client privilege?
I can't speak for that. There was no concern from the city of San Diego regarding the cost of the Hawkins and Delafield law firm. Their billing practices were not out of line with what they expected.
Okay, is there a time sensitivity to advancing this? This is an RFP that went out last July, so we've been working on this for a while. If we could hold this in committee and have a closed session so that some of the legal issues that Mr. Englander had concerns about, Mr. Rosendahl was also concerned about, I think it would facilitate matters just to be able to have that discussion. Unless there's a time sensitivity that we should be aware of, that would be my preference.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
I'd like to see when we do have it come back, if we could address the issue of negotiating both facilities, which is what the RFP, I believe, stated as well for these. And
I'd be happy to address that.
Okay. Okay. Without objection, then, we will hold this matter in committee and request additional discussion in closed session on this item.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, item 9 is a city attorney report and ordinance relative to the amendment of the Los Angeles Municipal Code to refer administrative tax liens directly to the full city council for approval.
Good afternoon, Valentin Dino, City Attorney's Office. In accordance with instructions from this committee, we have prepared and presenting today a draft ordinance which would have the effect of routing all of the administrative tax liens that are requested by the Office of Finance directly to the City Council, bypassing any committee assignment. And this will be the only effect of this draft ordinance.
So streamline things a little bit for us.
Sounds
Colleagues.
good to
Is
me.
there any objections?
if I can streamline this and just move it forward.
Thank you very
No
much.
discussion.
So second.
Without objection, that will be the action of the committee. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, and that brings us now to our closed session items. I don't have any cards on those, so we will now recess to closed session. Back into open session now. If we can just open the door. All right, we are now in open session. General public comment was already completed. There being no public comment on any of the remaining agenda and agendized items, we are adjourned.
All right, thank you.